Well, President Biden making an unannounced trip to Kyiv, Ukraine, early this morning on his way to visit Poland. It's his first trip to the war-torn country since the Russian invasion. As Stephen Portnoy reports, the president met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, during which he renewed his pledge of U.S. support.
Remind us that freedom is priceless. It's worth fighting for.
With Russia's war in Ukraine raging on, President Biden made a surprise trip to Kyiv, where he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Russia's aim was to wipe Ukraine off the map. Putin's war of conquest is failing.
The president spent about 6 hours in Ukraine's capital, where he marked the end of the first year of the conflict.
1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands.
U.S. officials say Russia was notified of the trip some hours before the president arrived, but the movements of the American president were kept secret.
After leaving Ukraine, President Biden headed here to Poland to discuss military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine with a broader group of Eastern European leaders.
Speaking in Kyiv, the president announced an additional military aid package for Ukraine of around $500 million.
That announcement includes artillery ammunition for HIMARS and howitzers, more javelins, anti-armor systems, air surveillance radars to help protect Ukrainian people.
Over the weekend, Vice President Harris told a security conference in Germany that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine.
To all those who have perpetrated these crimes, you will be held to account.
The declaration could ultimately lead to war crimes charges against Russian officials.
And that was Stephen Portnoy reporting. Ukraine is planning a spring counteroffensive against Russia and is asking the West for more heavier and longer range weapons.